What does Carl Jung mean by individuation? We're going to have a look at that. How is it like initiation? How is it done? What was the procedure? And what was actually happening to him? What happens in the individuation process? So when Carl Jung talks about individuation, he's not very specific about what or how it's done. He's not very specific about his metaphysics either, which actually the truth of his metaphysics are he's an idealist in the sense of he's a Platonist. So though he's an empiricist in his research, it's all based on experience and what he clinically observes in people and himself, which his investigations are of himself. He does both a interior investigation of the psyche, but also in treating patients, he does a empirical investigation of the things he's investigating, which are the archetypes and the psychological complexes and how they manifest. Freud discovered one of the motivating factors of humanity, which is the sexual libido, and then Adler was all about the will to power. But what Jung discovered deeper down is homo religio, which is deeper layers of the psyche and a different type of energy, really. And so what does individuation mean? What it means really is the synthesis of the conscious and the unconscious. It's a harmonizing of the organism and that brings the center not into the ego, but center in the self, and it takes over the motivating factors. What it wants becomes more important than the ego. And the different organs of psychic organs, let's call them, which are in the final analysis, subjective entities, you could call them, but actually end up being objective. They are all harmonized together in this process. And so he did that through what could be understood as a depth psychological Socratic dialogue with the different psychic organs of the unconscious. So while you're awake now, there are things that sleep that are watching, let's say. That's what he believed. The things that are the anima, the animus, the shadow, and the self, which encompasses it all, they are also subjects. They are also see what you see, and they are operating under the surface. You just can't see them. So, but what that individuation process is the same as what the Hermeticists and the Christian Hermeticists have always done: initiation, purification. So what Jung ends up completing in his individuation is the purification stage of initiation. What it really is too is a transvaluation of all value of the psychic being. So what's happened since the ground of all the ancient philosophy is in modernism, the transvaluation that's occurred over the 1,000 years is towards will to power. So what Nietzsche was talking about actually using it to transvaluate all value, that's already happened. That's an automatic process of, well, as we understand, it's part of temporality, it's part of the fall, it's not the ground of reality. There are deeper layers, which Jung uncovers. And so his transvaluation that goes on for him is a healing of this dead, stagnant organism which lusts after power. And so what is a transvaluation? Is that not just another word to replace individuation? No. What is a value? It is a tendency, an impulsion that tells you what to reject and what to go after. It's the grand set of all the things that automatically you are impelled towards, let's say. That's how it manifests in the modern world. It's your soul, it's your anima, which actually is, let's say, you've got the whore of Babylon as your soul, because it's the likeness, not the image, which the image of the soul, which is actually outside and divine, is let's say the Virgin Mary, right? The virgin nature, or Zoe, which is virginal libido. So that process has gone the other way. And so what you're doing is healing that, let's just think about it, all the sodomous desires that you've got from pornography, whatever it may be. all your lusts, all the things that have even happened to you that have infiltrated how you value things. Let's say your hates and your wounds and your scars. That in this process that he goes through is a healing of all those tendencies, right? And that's the transvaluation of all value for the being, changing the anchor from a lust of the individual subject to a will to service, from a will to power of the individual to a will to service of something higher and outside the individual subject. Jung goes through this process practically with what he calls active imagination. The initiates do something similar, but Jung does it in a more complicated way, like I said. So this process of healing, he is almost like the therapist in going into the unconscious. Everyone can access this active imagination. A better way, I think, of what you should call it is active unconscious. It's the unconscious that can be observed, and is the edges of it are accessible to the conscious ego to begin with what is called concentration without effort. Jung does it by a kind of free association, and he sort of lapses into a half sleep state. But the passive can be allowed to enter the conscious while you're concentrating, which is what initiates do and what yoga does, and Christian silence, monastic silence does the same thing. But so Jung was doing that. But you can see the very beginnings of this if you look at, say, a grey wall or up at the sky. You'll be able to see floaters in your eyes, right? You should also be able to see, and this isn't everyone, but you should be able to see a static that's like a very transparent television static when you don't have any channel tuned in, or film grain might be another way of saying that. This static field, Jung is attending that and letting it free associate. That static field is the edge of the unconscious. That static field is your access point to what is more unconscious to you, and it plays a role in how being is presencing to you, actually. What I do and what the initiates do is you attend the center of your visual plane, or the center of this static field, and the all at the same time, and all of it at the same time. And what you do is, while you're consciously attending, you allow the passive, or a kind of sleepiness being, right, like a relaxing being, to also come up too. That's, your body's completely relaxed. And what that does is, again, basically, it's synthesizing the collaboration of the unconscious and the conscious. Essentially, that's what ends up happening. So what Jung does is go a bit further and drops into a almost half sleep state where he's dialoguing with the different psychic organs. Whereas an initiate, what he's doing is those tendencies come up for you while you're concentrating without effort, while you're in silence, which is, again, what people that are doing yoga do with meditation. When you do it properly, when you understand something's outside. What Jung understands here, these psychic organs, it's not just subjective, it's beyond that. You're dealing with beings that are outside this, like the collective unconscious. It's not just an archetype, they're entities, right? Especially when you go deeper down and it's beyond just the personal likeness. When you stop, and that's another thing that happens in this individuation process, is you go close to the truth. You're becoming less arbitrary and moving towards the good. You're being healed, but from somewhere. It's not the Übermensch, which is what Jung learns throughout the process, is that he's not just doing this on his own. And you can see this if you actually read the whole canon of Jung, the red book, the black book, is that when he's talking to the different entities of the unconscious in the dialogue, they describe interacting with deeper levels. Like the anima talks about Philemon, who's the wise old man, or the self, Nietzsche's self. Nietzsche has the quote where he talks about that below, deep down in becoming, there is a mighty commander. That is the self, the fallen self, though, as in the empirical self, not the transcendent self, which is outside and eternal. But in Jung's discussions with the unconscious, he's constantly communicating with his anima, which is his soul, who is also being healed at the same time. And she's telling him of Philemon giving sermons to the dead. And the dead are his own being. The sermons are this is going on outside of him. He's not doing it as the therapist. He does sort of treat it like he's the therapist of the different psychic organs, but he's being healed from outside. And what eventually happens with Jung, and I think people don't understand this, is that it's not the self that does the healing. Jesus Christ visits him, right? Eventually. And Jung, from his arbitrary studies of Gnosticism and the pagan elements, without even trying to, his being is healed and becomes Christian. And he is Christian by the end of it. And this is not with reading the Bible. He does know the Bible and deals with some biblical figures, but he starts with Philemon and these pagan elements, but he comes into Christianity and he's finally visited by Christ. And you can see all what's going on very symbolically. That's what's happening. Like he meets the darkness. He goes through death. And this is all the resurrection, right? This is the Black Negredo of the alchemists. And he realizes all this happening after, once he starts to read and study the alchemist books, because he goes through this active imagination process without knowing what he's doing, which is what you're supposed to do, really. You've got to follow your star. And really what is implicitly happening is he's concentrating while that's going on. And what happens in initiation is that concentration essentially is with collaborating with something outside of yourself that's higher than you. It's reevaluating all value. It's basically with the oaths of solar law, obedience, chastity, and silence, or what is also called poverty, with those oaths and the procedures that go along with them, are purifying the soul. You're dissolving it over time with the help of something outside. You don't do it alone. When you try to do it alone, you become the Uberman, which is essentially what the yoga person does, but he loses the ability to have a relationship with entities. And he ends up just being nirvanic and escaping, not interacting with the world, but just escaping into absolute freedom. And that's why they're always in the yogic pose, not in the walking pose. And they're not the service of the divine. They are just checking out, really. Yes, they're healed in the sense of the demons, but they lose the ability to cry. They're not caring about reality. And that's why when the pagans talk about Christianity being, oh, you're just anti-temporal. No, that's Buddhist. That's checking out. That's nirvanic. No, we're not of this world, but we're here to save it, in the sense that we love the world and we have a divine mission to bring this solar law and true solar law into the temporal. That's what a Christian is. So no, Christians don't hate the temporal. They love the eternal and they bring heaven. He says later in interviews that they ask him, do you believe in God? He says, no, I know God exists. So he truly completes the purification process once he finishes the book on alchemy. And this also happened to Thomas Aquinas. When he finishes his works, he has the mystical, I don't know if it's the full completion of mystical union, which is like the beatific vision with God. It's the actualization of the transcendent self, which he becomes a meeting of the eternal and temporality together, right? Sacred space. You essentially become sacred space. So your being, the world's alive for you. It's full of meaning and life because you have become the Christ child. You've become filled with the being of the eternal, not just in a way it looks, but yeah, the way it looks. Factically, the way it presences to you is different to other people. And this is true of all mystics, right? You can just look into mystic experience. And all alchemists, that's what they were up to. But Jung completes it at the end of that, because part of it is symbolic, in the sense that when you are analyzing symbols, he's gaining an illumination, because the next step of the initiation is purification, illumination, union. So he is participating also in that illumination too. And by the end of it, he has this transcendental experience where the eternal manifests for him. Like, how do you complete this process? Well, it is monastic silence. That's one part of the oath. You could do it his way, but his way is much more complicated. And that's why no one really does it, because it's quite hard to develop the ability not only to bring the unconscious up and to attend and concentrate at the same time, but to also then slip into a dialogue. You have to sort of go to sleep. It's another layer of training on top of it. And you could do this for, I don't want to go into all the practices today because we're talking about Jung, But it is about that. It's about the three oaths. So one of them is obedience, and that's to solar law, which is the Ten Commandments, but fully understood. So when we say one of the commandments is honor your father and mother, that means the tradition. Honor the tradition. What has been is your father, right? Honor the tradition, but also don't let it be stagnant, because you have to honor the mother too, the creative influence. Nietzsche was quite right when he was very heroic in fighting what was the moon king, but he was the moon prince in the sense of active nihilism isn't the solution, because it's like trying to bootstrap yourself in water with the water when you're drowning. And Jung recognizes that, because when Nietzsche falls to the adversary that he's trying to face all this time, he faces the adversary with the adversary's force, which is the self, right? The lower self is corrupted by the will to power. He's one-eyed like Odin, if you want to think about it that way. And one-eyed means you don't have an eye in the eternal. You've got an eye only for temporality and the desires of temporality. And you have to look past that, because you can't, when you face the spirit of the depths, it's the spirit of destruction, the spirit of antithesis. It's the hero, but the juvenile hero, in the sense of the Gabor. It's the early lust for power. It's the will to power, the will to mournice, the will to turn everything into standing reserve, the will to conquer all. And Jung talks very specifically about this, and I hope that Nietzscheans pay more attention to when he does talk about this in his work, is that the hero has to die. Siegfried has to die in you. That lust for, desire to be the top of the hierarchy via compulsion, to compel everyone to your low, early mimetic will. Because your mimetic will is, you basically are a product of the people around you. What you should be doing is trying to be a product of something that's outside in the eternal, to receive outside signal so you can be something from a free state. And Nietzsche was trying to do that. So the people that are pushing the will to power and a kind of hedonism are really kind of failing Nietzsche, failing what he was trying to do. And so Jung says you have to let that person die, and you let that person die to be of service to the divine, to heal. It becomes a will to service. But also it's a recognition from your own suffering that you're not capable of solving this problem, and no one is. You can be a yogic person and a sorcerer like Wim Hof, and Jung didn't do this. He recognized that the other forces were at work, and he needed them, and that's why it worked out so well for him. He barely survived. He almost identified his actualization of the transcendent self as him becoming God, like the yogics. Not all yogic people did that, but most of them attribute it to be God, the transcendent self. And what happens with that is, again, you just check out as nirvanic. You're not communicating with beings that are higher than you anymore, and it becomes just and they even say it in yogic tradition, that it becomes gods are just a means by which the transcendent self can be actualized. No, that's where it becomes a problem and disconnected from the divine, right? And that's why when the Orthodox are sort of right when they say it's demonic, because ultimately when it's not connected to the Lord and the outside, which are demonstratable facts if you seek them once you've completed this process, not think that you're above it and you've mastered it, and then you don't need any more help. And that's the last temptation that offers itself to you. What happened with these yogis is they eventually believed that it was them that did it, and they became technical practices. And you can see this in how Wim Hof acts. Wim Hof is kind of going insane because they turn them into a procedure, a breathing procedure, rather than breathing that's guided from outside, rather than breathing that's guided by beings that are futural and know, or archetypes you can call them, and know what's healthy for you, because that's how it began. But then you end up with a Superman. He's got this technical procedure, and that's very dangerous. It's sacrilegious. This Kundalini is very dangerous. When you try do it based on some procedure, you're going mad. You are lifting irrational forces up at the same time, and and they become Luciferic. There's a great artwork of a Lucifer, and he's got his elbow over his arm like this, and it's just for him. It's this nirvanic experience just for you. and you just sit on a chair meditating in nirvana in this beautiful whatever but you're not helping anyone else, right? You're not coming back to save the world. You're not letting the divine act through you, and that's what you're supposed to do. But that's the final temptation of mastery.